Okay, colleagues, welcome back. So we have finally come to the end of the wonderful article by Richard Parry, and the last section deals with the Pyrrhonian skepticism. So I promised yesterday to say a couple of words about skepticism, so maybe I'll use this video to some extent to rectify that. So, Pyrrho, a murky figure contemporary with Epicurus and Zeno the Stoic, left no writings. So Pyrrho, like Socrates, like many others, like Diogenes, wrote nothing. In the late anecdotal oral tradition, Pyrrho is credited with introducing suspension of judgment, epoche. It's an important principle. I'm going to talk about, I think, in a second. So Pyrrho became the eponymous hero for the founding of the Pyrrhonian skepticism in the 1st century before the Common Era. Because for every argument there is an opposing argument, Pyrrhonian skeptics expressed no determinate opinions. So again, it's an important element of the skeptical doctrine that for every argument there is an opposing argument. And also the problem of the criterion. Anyway, this attitude would seem to lead to a kind of epistemic paralysis. The skeptics reply that they do not abolish, for example, relying on sight. They do not say that it is unreliable. They do not say that, skeptics, ancient skeptics, and there were different kinds of skepticism. There was also academic skepticism that was rooted in Plato's Academy, but Pyrrhonian skepticism is its own beast. The most important philosopher of the Pyrrhonian skeptics is going to be Sextus Empiricus. I'm going to talk about him maybe at a later point at greater length. I had an occasion to mention Sextus on several times already. Anyway, so the Pyrrhonian skeptics do not say that sight is unreliable. And Pyrrhonian skeptics do not refuse personally ever to rely on sight. Rather, they have the impression that there is no reason why they are entitled to rely on sight in any given case or in general. So, like, we are forced to rely on sight, but they would bracket the judgment, they would suspend the judgment as to whether sight gives an accurate picture of reality or not. And even if we go ahead and rely on sight anyhow, we do not commit ourselves to the further view that our eyesight, vision, actually gives us accurate representation of reality. For example, if one has the visual impression of a tower, that appearance is not in dispute. Like, if you have a visual experience of a tower, then undoubtedly you do have a visual experience of a tower. It may be an illusion, but still it is true that you have an illusion of a tower. What it seems one cannot know is whether the tower is as it appears to be. For the skeptics, claiming that the tower is as it appears to be is a dogmatic statement about the explanation of the appearance. One can never have a warrant of for such a statement. So we have a deep commitment to empiricism in the Pyrrhonian doctrine. So maybe I can try to put up my slides from yesterday and talk about this maybe for 1 second. So again, this is Pyrrho of Elis, writing approximately between Aristotle and Epicurus. There's a legend according to which Pyrrho maybe was influenced by Indian philosophy. And then the most important compiler of ancient Pyrrhonian skepticism is Sextus Empiricus, basically because his works have survived. So the problem of the criterion, we could talk about this in the ancient context, but I could mention it in modern contemporary terms. It seems that there are two ways that we can try to ground our knowledge of reality. One is observation, the other one is logic. And if we talk about observation, there's the problem of deduction, which we're going to talk about when we get to David Hume. This is the idea that when you observe something, you see what you see, but what is on the other side of your observation? Could it be that it's an illusion, or maybe you're mad, or maybe there's an evil demon tricking you, right? And if you observed something in the past, how do you know that you will continue to observe it in the future? So empirical knowledge cannot really be safely generalized beyond immediate experience. This is the problem known as the problem of, this is obviously the problem of induction. Well, my slides are wrong. That's okay. It happens sometimes. And when we try to rely on logic, well, you see, the question is how can we prove the validity of logic? And if you have to assume that logic is reliable in order to use logic, well, that's a problem. And this is actually known as the problem of deduction, associated, I think, in modern philosophy with the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein, but also, more importantly, with Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I don't want to go into this right now. Still, so even though you have this negative skeptical attitude, the appearances are taken to be a practical criteria for action. As a practical criterion for action, the skeptics take the appearances. The criterion then of the skeptical school is, we say, the appearance, giving this name to what is virtually the sense presentation. Adhering then to appearances, we live in accordance with the normal rules of life, undogmatically, seeing that we cannot remain wholly inactive. Yeah, I think this deserves a separate video in order to express and expound it. But like in general, if we think back to Gorgias, again, his supposition that nothing exists, even if something did exist, it could not be known, and even if it could be known, it could not be communicated successfully, right? So this idea that skeptics continue to live normal lives, and in fact, in a certain important respect, like for the Stoics, there's an important conservative element, right? When in Rome, do as the Romans. Because the skeptics follow the appearances. Like I wake up in the morning and I have an appearance. It appears to me that I want to get out of bed. It appears to me that I'm hungry. And rather than fight against these appearances, I just acquiesce in their sight. I just go along with them. So if I actually had a quote. Not sure. I cannot see the quote. I had a very important quote about acquiescing in the sight of appearances. Adhering to appearances. Well, anyway, again, there's this okay, this is confusing. This is confusing. I'm sorry, this is not going according to plan. Well, again, I'll try to double check this. The ultimate idea is that, again, the appearances seem to force themselves upon us, and we simply do not fight against them. This is the basic idea. Okay. Let's go back to the article to the extent possible. Anyway, so yeah. So such views have an obvious impact on practical and moral issues. So the skeptical views have an obvious impact on practical and moral issues. First of all, the skeptics argue that so far as we have been given any good reason by philosophers to believe, there is nothing good or bad by nature. So there's an equal argument on both sides. So there's no reason to believe that anything is good or bad by nature. Now, notice, this is not the same thing as saying that the skeptics can prove that nothing is good or bad by nature, but at least they see no reason to assert that. So this is kind of undogmatic negative skepticism. They do not assert any negative doctrines. They simply refuse to commit themselves to any positive doctrines. The skeptical argument is that what is good by nature would be recognized by everyone, but not everyone agrees about what is good by nature. Again, think back to this problem of evil, sort of if gods were visible in this world, or let's say if everybody, talking about the law of nature for the Stoics, for example, if everybody unproblematically agreed about what the law of nature is, that would be one thing. But patently, obviously there is deep disagreement. Anyway, not everyone agrees about what is good by. Not everyone agrees about what is good by nature. For instance, Epicurus holds that pleasure is good by nature, but Antisthenes holds that it is not. However, the skeptic would not dogmatically hold that nothing is good by nature, but rather would suspend judgment. Again, this principle of epoche. Anyway, so the subtlety of suspension of judgment is illustrated by two traditions about the life of Pyrrho. In one, Pyrrho himself did not avoid anything, whether it was wagons, precipices, or dogs. It would appear that suspending judgment about whether being hit by a wagon was naturally good or bad, Pyrrho might walk into its path and not bother to get out of the way. This sounds implausible to be, again, this is not the way Sextus would talk about this. Sextus would say that, again, certain appearances force themselves on us and we simply give up in the face of appearances because, you suspend judgment, there's no reason to fight against your instincts. And again, for the same reason, Pyrrhonian skeptics are going to be committed to ataraxia, this calmness, because it naturally feels good without any further argument. Anyway, so Pyrrho's less skeptical friends kept him alive, presumably by guiding him away from busy roads, vicious dogs, and deep gorges. Another tradition, and I think this is a better interpretation. Another tradition, however, says that Pyrrho only theorized about suspension of judgment and took action to preserve himself and otherwise lead a normal life, but doing so without any judgments as to the natural good or bad. Living providently, he reached 90 years of age, according to tradition. And again, I think the second interpretation is a much better interpretation. You see, when you walk down the street and there's a bus rushing in your face, you jump out of the way without thinking about it. You don't necessarily commit yourself to the truth that there's a bus rushing towards you, right? In an important sense, your body takes over, and the skeptic would say you just let the body take over without fighting the instinct. Anyway, in any event, Pyrrho's suspension of judgment led to a certain detachment. Not knowing what was good or bad by nature, Pyrrho was indifferent, where dogmatists would be unhappy or at least anxious. For instance, he performed household chores, usually done by women. Thus, Pyrrho's skepticism detached him from dogmatic judgments of a culture in which men's performing women's work was considered demeaning. In return, his skepticism and suspension of judgment led to freedom from disturbance, again, ataraxia. I'm not sure if I have this quote somewhere, but yeah, well, I have this quote. Let's look at this for 1 second. Yeah, so for those who hold the opinion that things are good or bad by nature, so this is a quote from Sextus Empiricus, those who hold the opinion that things are good or bad by nature are perpetually troubled. When they lack what they believe to be good, they take themselves to be persecuted by natural evils, and they pursue what they think is good. And when they have acquired these things, they experience more troubles, for they are elated beyond reason and measure, and in fear of change, they do anything so as not to lose what they believe to be a good. But those who make no determination about what is good and what is bad by nature neither avoid nor pursue anything with intensity, and hence they are tranquil. Again, we should, ideally we should have a whole separate class in order to explain this properly, but hopefully you are getting the basic idea as to this intuition as to how skepticism leads to tranquility, suspension of judgment. And again, I think there's an important similar important skeptical insight in Buddhism, also for this practical reason of becoming calmer and getting oneself closer to nirvana by avoiding committing yourself to views which you do not know whether they're true or not. And there's a very famous story about the Buddha, about when Buddha was asked, is there life after death? Or is there a God? Or does the soul exist? He refused to answer these questions, maintaining instead noble silence. So some versions of Buddhism would say that Buddha, of course, knew, but it's possible to say that, in some versions of Buddhism, you actually suspend judgment as to these matters. It doesn't matter whether the soul is immortal. It doesn't matter what's going to happen to us after we die. What is important is how we feel right now, here and now, in the moment. And in the moment, we would prefer to be free from disturbance. And this is what we aim for. And about these metaphysical questions, we suspend judgment, and this makes our life easier. Anyway, and like in general, I think this developing this skill of epoche is a very important, very valuable, paradigmatic philosophical enterprise. Again, so the epoche, the Greek word, means the state where all judgments about non-evident matters are suspended in order to introduce a state of ataraxia, freedom from worry and anxiety. Again, non-evident matters. So things which are forced upon us by our senses, we, of course, accept because there's no reason to fight against them. It would be dogmatic to say that senses necessarily deceive us. Okay, well, we know sometimes senses do deceive us, but by comparing one sense to another. Anyway. It is significant that this psychological state, so important for Epicureans as part of the end of good life, should play a key role in Pyrrhonian skepticism at its beginning with Pyrrho, but certainly in its development with Sextus Empiricus, who is again the most important systematizer of skepticism, whose works have survived to this day. While suspension of judgment in moral matters brings freedom from disturbance, it does not lead to immoral behavior, any more than it leads to the foolhardy behavior of the first tradition about Pyrrho's life. Pyrrhonian type of skepticism about what is good or bad by nature allowed Pyrrhonists to choose and avoid things according to habit and custom. Again, like in general, it seems that the Pyrrhonian recommendation is don't make trouble. When in Rome, do as the Romans, because again, the skeptics suspend judgment. Like there's no reason to make trouble. Sextus generalizes the skeptical teaching about appearances to cover the whole area of practical activity. He says the rules of everyday conduct are divided into 4 parts: the guidance from nature, compulsion that comes from bodily states like hunger and thirst, traditional laws and customs about pious and good living, and the teachings of the crafts. The skeptic is guided by all of these as by appearance and thus undogmatically. Again, later skeptic, important to us, David Hume, is going to say that, do I know that water quenches thirst or that fire gives warmth? Hume, echoing Sextus Empiricus, says, no, I do not know that. But my body forces me, it drives me to drink water when I'm thirsty. And what I do is I acquiesce, I give up in the face of appearances which are forced on me, in the absence of an effective argument against following my immediate desires. In this sense, again, I think that skepticism and Epicureanism are, broadly speaking, compatible. But skepticism and Stoicism, it seems to me, are not. Because the Epicureans are guided by this immanent criterion within one's soul, criterion of immediate well-being or pleasure, which is a kind of appearance, whereas the skeptics have this deeply problematic assumption about the natural order of the universe, and the skeptics would say, we don't know. Again, it's not like they dogmatically assert that there is no natural order to the universe. The skeptics don't know, but they suspend judgment as to whether there is a Zeus and as to whether Zeus's will actually governs the world, this right reason. Anyway, so for instance, the skeptic would allow the traditional laws about pious and good living, accepting these laws as the way things appear to him to be in matters of piety and goodness, but claiming no knowledge. So in this sense, the Sextian or the Pyrrhonian skeptic would even perform sacrifices to the gods, but undogmatically, without holding any view as to whether really the gods exist or not. The Sextian just makes the sacrifices to avoid causing trouble to himself and to others, to him or herself and to others. And you could say, well, how do you know that there's trouble? Well, again, trouble is an appearance, something that you can feel, a disturbance in the soul. You can feel it directly. Again, remember, for the skeptics, there's no reason to doubt that. Again, when I see a tower, I may be wrong that there's a tower, but I certainly see a tower. Likewise, when I'm in pain, I feel directly that I am in pain, and it directly feels unpleasant. I don't need a separate argument to establish the unpleasantness. Likewise, when I feel pleasure, I directly perceive it as something pleasant, as something I want. I don't need a separate argument to explain to myself as to why pleasure is the good. Anyway, Sextus says, and in fact, the skeptics would say that if you say that pain is good or that pleasure is evil, you need an argument for that. And it's not clear what the argument could be. Again, remember, the skeptics say that there's equal argument on every side of the issue, on both sides of the issue. So there's no reason to fight against the natural tendencies of the flesh, if you want. And I think that this establishes a basic compatibility between skeptics and Epicureans, even though Epicureans were not skeptics, and skeptics were not Epicureans. So there are differences, but I think there are also a deep basic compatibility, although the nuances are different. Anyway, Sextus says that the end of life is freedom from disturbance in matters of belief, plus moderate states in matters of compulsion. So this ataraxia and this other word I used yesterday, which is metriopatheia. So moderation of passion and freedom from disturbance. Suspension of judgment provides ataraxia, right? Provides freedom from disturbance in that one is not disturbed about which of the two opposing claims is true. When, as always seems to happen, one cannot rationally decide between them. And for the skeptics, it's never possible to rationally decide between alternatives. Matters of compulsion cover such things as so compulsion, basically our the appearances, our senses, our body takes over and forces us to do things. And we simply decide to not resist because we do not see a better argument for resisting. Matters of compulsion cover such things as bodily needs for food, drink, and warmth. While the skeptic undeniably suffers from hunger, thirst, or cold, he achieves a moderate state with respect to these suffering when compared to the person who both suffers them and believes that they are naturally bad. So in this sense, this epoche, suspension of judgment, actually diminishes the amount of suffering that an individual feels. The skeptic's suspension of judgment about whether his suffering is naturally bad gives him a certain detachment from suffering. Again, broadly speaking, I think similar to what some schools of Buddhism are saying. As a consequence, the skeptic conception of the end of life is similar in some ways to Epicurean and Stoic beliefs. For Epicureans, the end is freedom from pain and distress. The Stoic identification of virtue and the good promises freedom from disturbance. While Pyrrho and Sextus hold freedom from disturbance to be the end of life, they differ from the skeptics and Epicureans over the means to freedom from disturbance. The Epicureans, for example, hold that virtue is the infallible means to freedom from disturbance. By contrast, Sextus does not have a lot to say in a positive vein about virtue, although he does recommend following traditional laws about piety and goodness. Rather, for skeptics, it is an epistemic attitude, not virtue, that leads to the desired state. So what would Sextus say about the ring of Gyges? Well, I think it's a good question, right? Sextus would say that, you know, as a skeptic, you should suspend judgment. You do not know whether raping, pillaging, and murdering others will make you happier or not. So it's safer to just act in accordance with traditional morality. Again, it's broadly speaking a conservative attitude, and we will see again this link between conservatism and skepticism. We have seen it in Gorgias, we see it now in Sextus, and we will also see it in David Hume, who is broadly speaking also a conservative philosopher. Anyway, moreover, while Sextus talks about the end of life, the word for happiness is absent, conspicuously absent from the skeptical account. The omission of the word happiness may not be significant, since in the philosophical tradition happiness is generally understood to be the end of life. In any event, since the skeptics say so little about virtue, they could not be called eudaimonists, even if one allows that freedom from disturbance fills the same role as happiness does in eudaimonism. Following moral conventions might be a means to, or even a constituent of freedom from disturbance, but in this regard, it is no different from any other activity. Following moral conventions has a role in freedom from disturbance only if it is done with the appropriate epistemic attitude. Okay, so I have to sort of apologize because, you know, I see, you know, skeptics are fairly technical and fairly complicated. I feel that maybe I should do at some point in the future another pass at this and, you know, do this in a slightly more systematic fashion. But I suppose by way of a simple takeaway point, let me just focus on one important skeptic whom we'll talk about actually very soon, probably this Tuesday, and this is Thomas Hobbes. Again, you see, Hobbes is going to say that since we cannot agree on what is the good life, and again, remember in the previous video I was talking about how this, especially the beatific vision of the afterlife, so the presumed eternal bliss of paradise is unknown to us through direct experience. We should, in a certain important respect, I think in a skeptical fashion, for Hume as well as for Sextus, suspend judgment as to what happens to us after we die. And you see, again, Sextus recommends as the safer course of action, like when in doubt, right? When in doubt, just don't make trouble, because making trouble, making an effort, this is what this is what needs to be justified. And in this sense, I think there's a basic element of conservatism which we can see in Hobbes, which is broadly speaking similar to this conservatism of Sextus. In that Hobbes would say that unless something really horrible happens to your life, you should simply obey the authorities of the day. Just again, not make trouble again, because the potential risk is chaos. However, the Stoics, the skeptics, I think would say that again, that if something really horrible is happening to you, like again, imagine you're walking down the road and there's a truck or a bus rushing towards you, you jump out naturally because it takes an effort to not jump out of the way, right? And so you just follow the natural course of events. And I think in a similar fashion, Hobbes would say that when the sovereign loses power and when the country collapses into a war of all against all, then naturally, the contract becomes void. And you don't need a separate argument for that. In fact, it would take a separate argument for you to continue obeying the sovereign who does not protect you. Anyway, I'm sure these are nuanced issues, and I'm really only glossing over them. This is unfortunately had turned out to be the least satisfactory, at least to me, video of all the ones I've covered in this article by Richard Parry. But again, I'm going to leave it the way it is. But at a future date, I hope to do a second pass and maybe address these issues in a slightly more technical fashion. But in any case, don't worry too much, because skeptics are less important for us in our course, and we'll have an occasion to revisit some of these arguments when we talk, especially about Thomas Hobbes and David Hume, and especially John Stuart Mill. Okay, colleagues, in any case, I hope this was somewhat stimulating, although maybe not perfectly clear. Until next time, please take care.